Hello, young scholars. Welcome to another podcast on various topics in AP World and European history. And in this moment, we are going to be discussing the Enlightenment. This will be a very basic overview of the Enlightenment and some of its prime thinkers, and some sort of basic looks at the sort of intellectual and political impact thereof. Now, what is the Enlightenment? Well, I would argue that in many ways it is the sort of social, philosophical, political wing of the scientific revolution. I've discussed in previous podcasts the fact that the scientific revolution attempted very much to start looking at the world in a rational way and to emphasize observation, rationalism, reason, and skepticism over tradition, over faith placed in the church, over superstition, and attempted to sort of analyze the natural world in a rational and scientific way, using the scientific method, using experimentation, and so forth and so on. And I would tender, in the same way, the Enlightenment attempted to analyze human behavior in more or less the same way. Can we describe humanity in a rational way? Can we point out rational explanations for why people are the way that they are? And so it is basically a cultural and intellectual movement that applied the principles of this scientific revolution to looking at humanity. Now, there are a couple of sort of buzzwords that you need to be introduced to that tend to come up when one discusses the Enlightenment. I'm just going to run through these real quick. First of all, empiricism, the theory that all knowledge is derived from experience as perceived through the senses, that is observation. And again, this is very much a scientific revolutionary idea that here is sort of being applied forward to other fields of endeavor. Then inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when we use particular examples to reach a general conclusion. You'll see I've provided an example there that if I pick 4 candies out of a jar and 3 of them are red, I can induce rather, that 75% of the candies are red. And then deductive reasoning, which it sort of goes in reverse. It uses general statements to reach more specific conclusions. That is, I am a man, men eventually die, therefore I will eventually die. There's also a sort of sub-branch of philosophy and of the Enlightenment here that's called metaphysics, which deals with the nature and meaning of existence. And for example, looking at man in the so-called state of nature. It is important to point out also, this sort of covers the next two, that Paris is very much the capital of the Enlightenment, in spite of the fact that you have an absolutist monarchy that has a lot of rules about freedom of expression, and certainly not a free press. The wealth in France, the availability of printed materials, the cultured nature of French society is going to mean that it's a place where these Enlightenment ideas can sort of grow and percolate and develop, particularly in 2 locations. First of all, in the coffee houses, which are going to be sounding boards where people can talk about these Enlightenment ideas, but also in the salon. The salon, when you talk about the salon, like an actual room in a house, that is used for sort of unofficial social gatherings. I mean, we're not talking enormous ballrooms here. We're usually talking about small sort of tea rooms where you may have, 6 people, 10 people. And these are generally being hosted by sort of women from affluent families. So your nobles, your upper-class merchants. And in these places, that is where we are seeing a lot of these Enlightenment ideas being spread. People are getting together and talking about them, and it's not only an intellectual exercise, but also a social one. And the people who are participating in this are called philosophes, or in French, or translated from the French, philosophers. These are usually, again, upper middle class or nobility. They are the kind of people who do not necessarily have to work at a job like sort of like a an office job or a factory job or an agricultural job. They don't necessarily work for a living in the traditional sense, and so therefore they have the time to study, to write, to think philosophically, and to go to these salon and to sort of focus on the intellectual development of their ideas. And in that time, they because they're very tied into this notion of the scientific revolution, they sought to understand humanity through rational thought. Okay, if I want you to remember one word, excuse me, from this discussion of the Enlightenment, it is reason. For many of these philosophers and philosophes, reason is almost a god unto itself. And so through rational thought, they thought to understand humanity, and in many cases use that understanding as an avenue to reform the human race, socially, economically, politically. To that end, there are two ideas that we're going to see a lot of these philosophers expound on. First of all, the state of nature. So if we're going to study man, and if we're going to understand man rationally, we have to understand man at his most basic. That is, if we went back to, say, 12,000 BC, or even before that, let's even, 20,000 BC, whatever. If we went back to a moment in which there were no governments, there were no societies, if you had a situation where you had a handful of Neanderthals living together in the forests of Europe somewhere, what would they look like? And therefore, what can we say of man, our man's sort of natural tendencies? What are we like at our most basic level? The other idea that's going to come actually out of England, but become very central to this notion of the Enlightenment, is the notion of the social contract, which is the idea that whether it's explicit or implicit, that there is an arrangement between the governing body, be it king or parliament or whatever, and the people who are being governed by that body. And a lot of our philosophers are going to see this in slightly different ways. We'll talk about that in a moment. Lastly, the last thing I'll mention is deism. The idea that, in this new sort of rational world, the notion of a supernatural divine being such as God, who involves himself in the daily affairs of, the way that they saw it in the Middle Ages. We won this battle because God willed us to, or we survived the storm because it was God's will. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers aren't going to buy into that. Now, certainly they are not atheists in the sense that we think of atheism in, say, the 21st century, but they will, some of them at least, will take on a slightly different view of the divine. They will argue that God does in fact exist, but that he does not directly interfere with the world. And the analogy that is often used to explain deism is that of a clockmaker. A clockmaker who essentially builds the clock and then winds it up and allows it to run its course on its own. That's going to be particularly popular with individuals like Thomas Jefferson, for example, who famously wrote a version in the Bible that took out all of the miracles and sort of pared it down to something that was less supernatural in character. So, thinkers that you absolutely have to know, it would make sense to begin with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, technically, not necessarily an Enlightenment guy. He is writing really before the period that we think of as the Enlightenment, and he's not necessarily going to agree with the other Enlightenment thinkers, but I would tender that even if he comes to a slightly different conclusion, the manner in which he approaches looking at the human animal, so to say, is very Enlightenment in character. Hobbes is writing in the middle of the 17th century in England, just after the Civil War. In fact, his book Leviathan, which the cover is pictured here, is published about 2 years after the execution of Charles. So this is a guy who's definitely living through an absolutist government, watching that absolutist government clash with Parliament, and then witnessing the corresponding chaos that results from a time of civil war, and then also watching this sort of Cromwellian military dictatorship that springs up in the wake of Charles I's execution. Now, my students will have, or if you haven't done so, will have done, looked at a segment from Hobbes' Leviathan, in which he argues that in the state of nature, all men were essentially at war with one another, competing over resources, and so forth and so on. And it was what he described as the war of every man against every man, because in the absence of any kind of society or any kind of law, the only rule is to survive. And so, therefore, if you have an apple and I am hungry, then what's to stop me from just killing you and taking it? And if I have the apple and you're hungry, what's to stop you from doing the same? He argued that in this state of nature, man's life was nasty, brutish, and short. And those are probably the two quotes that I would really encourage you to remember from Hobbes: nasty, brutish, and short, and then the war of every man against every man. He argued, therefore, that we make a social contract with our government when we allow ourselves to be ruled over by someone or some institution. And that is that we receive from that government protection from the violation of our person and of our property. Theoretically, the government protects you from killing me and stealing my apple, hypothetically. However, that does require me to surrender some of my own liberty. I am not at liberty to kill you and take your apple. So I give up the ability to do a number of things that I might want to do, but in exchange I am being protected from all of the bad things that somebody else might want to do to me. And to that end, Hobbes argues whether or not you're going to have a parliament or a king, and keep in mind that this text is often used as a justification for absolute monarchy, that a very strong government that is like a leviathan, like a huge sort of monster, is essential to restrict human freedom and keep us from doing these bad things. Okay, and that is the we agree to submit ourselves to this sort of monster of a government in order to prevent terrible things from happening to us. So that's Hobbes. Also writing in England a little bit later in the 17th century is John Locke. Also technically not one of these so-called philosophers of the Enlightenment, but his work is absolutely crucial. And he argues, and he's writing in England right around the time of the Glorious Revolution, so a much more positive view of English politics was presented to him, obviously, and that may have influenced his writing. He wrote that every man has the right, regardless of who they are, to life, liberty, and property. Okay, these are the things that every man should be able to have. You should be able to stay alive, you should be free from being enslaved, and you should be able to acquire property. You should have the opportunity to go get some land and have a house and so forth and so on. Now, he argued that in the state of nature, every man was equal and tolerant and reasonable. So whereas Hobbes is typically seen as taking a very negative view of human nature, humans will naturally try and kill and steal and take from one another, John Locke argued that naturally human beings are good. And John Locke also argues in favor of what's called tabula rasa, which is to say that everybody is born essentially a blank slate, and what we become is a result of our experiences. The people we meet, the things that we see happen, things that we do, things that are done to us. And therefore, the evils that are described by Hobbes, greed and the desire to destroy, those are choices. Those are things that are developed that humans choose to do over time. Therefore, he's going to take a slightly different view of the social contract from Hobbes as well. He's going to argue that governments exist to preserve our rights. And therefore it's sort of obvious that, well, okay, we're willing to sort of submit to these governments because they preserve our rights. But he argues that the actual social contract isn't agreeing to give up our rights, like Hobbes said. He says, because the government exists to preserve our rights, our right to life, liberty, and property in particular. Okay, this is very important. This, by the way, should sound awfully familiar until we get to this last word. John Locke argues that if the government does not protect our rights, if the government enslaves us, if the government takes away our property, then the government can be overthrown. So the agreement then, the contract is that the people are allowed to overthrow the government if the government doesn't hold up its end of the bargain. And this is a very radically new idea in a lot of ways. Well, perhaps not so much in England, because we've seen in England already that we've had kings deposed or executed when the Commons viewed them as not having done what they ought. So anyway, in many ways, Locke is considered to be the father of classical liberalism. And classical liberalism centers around the idea that government must be limited in order to preserve an individual's rights. He's very unlike the absolute monarchs who are going to argue that government has to be absolute. And obviously, he largely disagreed with Hobbes. And again, this is a relatively radical idea. This notion that the king doesn't govern because he's God appointed. The king governs because he is there to sort of help his people, to preserve his people's rights, and that they can remove him. Which again, a monarch who saw themselves as God anointed and sort of chosen by the divine to lead would have been horrified by this notion. Now, since I'm talking about liberalism here, we need to take a brief moment to talk about the political spectrum. When you are looking at the political spectrum, basically you have sort of three positions. You have the liberal, the moderate, and the conservative. The liberal is always spoken of as being on the left. So when people talk about, oh, that guy is a leftist, or man, that person leans really far left, they are usually referring to them as being liberal. The conservative position is always on the right. So again, man, that guy's really far right. That means that they are conservative. And then, of course, in the middle, we have some moderates who may, sort of lean slightly to one side, but not particularly extreme, or, may hold a sort of different, some conservative views on some issues, some liberal views on others. And this notion is... well, it goes back quite a ways. We saw examples of this in the Roman Empire, where the Senate, when they would sit in session, certain groups of people who agreed with each other would sit on one side and on the other. Certainly the same thing happens in the British Parliament. And this idea of left versus right really comes from the period of the French Revolution, when all the liberals sat on the left, all the supporters of the crown and all the monarchists and the members of the church and that sort of thing tended to sit on the right. Now, what do liberal and conservative actually mean? Well, that is a very, very tough question, actually, and it is going to depend on the time and place in which you are asking it, because European liberalism and conservatism is going to look very different from what we see in America. And then, two, the definition of those terms will also change across time. Basically, your conservative, it's in the word, conserve, right? Your conservatives tend to be trying to conserve something. Now, that does not mean that they are unwilling to change, but it does mean that typically there is something that they are trying to preserve, something that they are trying to keep whole, and so they tend to be averse to certain types of change. That they feel are going to endanger the social order, that kind of thing. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to be, again, John Locke is a relatively good example. This old world order of divine monarchy, we don't believe is accurate or useful. We want to create change. We want to change the social order to give us something that we feel is going to protect our liberties. Okay, So it's not necessarily strictly about this group wants freedom and this one doesn't. It's not necessarily about this one wants monarchy and this one doesn't. It is going to run far deeper and far more complicated than that. But generally speaking, I think we could argue that conservatives tend to be more willing to preserve the existing socioeconomic and political order. Liberals tend to be more willing to change it. Again, I'm sure there are 100 people who would be willing to disagree with me on this, and in fact, I'm disagreeing with myself. So I'm going to move on, but just keep this continuum in mind because it's going to become particularly important as we get into the French Revolution and then also into the 19th and 20th century. Anyway, continuing back to our authors. We did Hobbes, we did Locke, now we must do Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was born in 1712, lives until 1778. He is actually born in Geneva, so he's Swiss, and was abandoned by his family, so he had kind of a tough life growing up. He worked in Italy and France, and he paid his way through school by working as a paid companion, which, you know, he's a pretty sharp-looking guy. You can imagine why somebody would be interested in having him as their companion, I suppose. So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's arguments regarding the state of nature. Kind of like Locke. People originally in the state of nature were fine and happy. We were all just hanging out, being, maybe not being very far above the animals in terms of our development, but we were all happy. Everybody was, eating and, apples or whatever, and nobody was trying to kill each other or anything until the introduction of private property. Once humans invent this notion that, hey, this particular thing belongs to me and not to you, at that point we sort of start this snowball running that eventually is going to lead us up to the situation in which we find ourselves, where we have to create these governments to protect that private property. And therefore humans have gone not into liberty, not into things improving, far from just progress. We've actually put ourselves in chains, and we have subordinated ourselves to these governments because of our fear of losing our property. And so he argues that government is sort of a necessary evil. His view of the social contract then is colored by this. He says, people agree to be governed by the general will. That is the will of the majority. Now, he would probably tender that this is kind of in tandem with what Locke has to say, because you can have a general will in a monarchy as well. The monarch knows that he has to keep a majority of people happy on at least a basic level, or else they're going to revolt and overthrow him. So, a great example is somebody like Catherine the Great, who says, okay, I would really like to be able to have all these new sort of enlightened laws, but I know that's going to upset the nobility, so I'm not going to do it. And then, of course, you can see relatively easily how if you have an elected body, like in Britain, for example, that you also have the the potential for this general will to exert itself. And so, essentially, the social contract is people agree to be governed by this will of the majority, because what's best for the group is also typically best for the individual. Rousseau also famously criticized the English Parliament for enslaving people and saying, like, you talk about how you represent the commons, but you really don't, because you're all just a bunch of landholders. He is also really, really favored by some of the American revolutionaries, like Thomas Paine, for example, who famously said, "The palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise." That is to say that this idyllic sort of Eden that Rousseau believes that we lived in was sort of plowed over to put down the palaces that these kings would then use to exploit and enslave the population. Rousseau also criticized slavery and this whole notion of private property. And he was something of a writer as well. He wrote a text called Emile in 1762, that was a novel about the education of a man, in which a boy learns from nature and sort of experience, and then ethics, and then reason. So we continue to see that word creeping in. And again, you'll notice that all three of these men are using sort of, deductive reasoning, in a sense. If this is what man is generally like, then this is sort of the best form of government that he should comport himself to. This is what it then means that people are sort of agreeing to be governed by, and all that sort of thing, right? Okay, so moving on. Baron de Montesquieu, French nobleman and a student of the law. He is famous for the writing of the Persian Letters in 1721, in which he actually critiqued both the monarchy and the Catholic Church. But he actually wrote it from the point of view of these two Persian gentlemen, these two Muslims visiting France, and published it under a pen name to avoid getting in trouble with the government. And here, it's the same kind of thing where when people say, if two aliens came down to our world today, what would they think? It's the same kind of idea. If we bring in these two Muslims who are from such a radically different culture, what would they notice? What would they see? And one of his complaints was of sort of the arbitrary exercise of power in the church and the monarchy, and he argued that a separation of powers, or what we also sometimes call checks and balances, would provide the most freedom and security. Branches of the government, he argued, have to be prevented from doing things that they oughtn't to do by some other organization within the government. All right, there needs to be, nobody should have complete and total power. So he's very much not an absolutist, even though he is living in France during the reigns of Louis XIV, Louis XV. All right. Another gentleman who is particularly important. This is Voltaire, whose real name was François-Marie Arouet. And he lives in born at the very end of the 17th century. Literary works, two big ones: Candide, which comes out in 1759, a satiric look at European society and also, in a sense, the human condition, because it is not confined to Europe. They actually travel all over the place, and it's about optimism versus pessimism. It's actually quite a fascinating book if you ever have a chance to read it. He also wrote a more philosophical work, a treatise on the human condition, 1763. Whoops, we got a little spelling issue here, in which he champions deism, or deism, I should say, and attacks religious fanaticism. And in this text, his most famous quote that you should remember is, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." So Voltaire is a really, really big advocate of free speech. And obviously this, too, is a notion that is going to really have a huge influence on the Enlightenment. Voltaire famously corresponded a lot with Frederick II of Prussia. They wrote letters to each other. They even visited each other from time to time. And so, he really influences the development of the Prussian monarchy in that way. Voltaire is also highly quotable, and so I cannot move on without sharing just a couple of his quotes. We already mentioned in my class, Prussia is Sparta in the morning and Athens in the afternoon. He also says at one point, in France, we find it beneficial to shoot an admiral from time to time to encourage the others. He also said God is always on the side of the big battalions. That is to say, he's sort of mocking people who believe that God interferes directly in the affairs of man, by saying that, isn't it funny that God always supports the people who have sort of the most troops, and that kind of thing. He also argues that every man is guilty of all the good he didn't do. So even though he is somewhat a-religious, he is certainly not amoral. And he also argued if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And then finally, one of my favorites as a historian, history is a pack of lies we play on the dead. All right, so Voltaire, really, really interesting guy, very sharp-witted. Okay, two more guys. Number one, Diderot. Diderot, also a Frenchman, middle class, Jesuit education. And he is important because he wrote the first encyclopedia, which it actually took him almost 20 years to complete. And then Immanuel Kant, who is Prussian. He's our only sort of Eastern European philosopher. He's extremely regular in his behavior. Supposedly, he would wake up every morning at the exact same time and take a walk down the exact same streets and come back, and he was just very all shoes at right angles, kind of guy. It was said that people in the town that he lived in would set their clocks according to when he passed by their window. and supposedly he only broke his routine one time to read one of Rousseau's books on the day that it came out in his town. He went, got the book, sat all day and read it, and then the next day just went straight back to his routine. Kant argued that we have to be very careful of the majority rule that was suggested by Rousseau because it can threaten individual liberty. And so in this sense, he sort of ensconces this notion of minority rights, that the majority can be just as great a tyrant as a single man can. Um, he also argued that a mixed government would be ideal. Some monarchy, some sort of legislative elected body, that kind of thing, which kind of plays into the notion of checks and balances proposed by Montesquieu. And he also argues that morals are universal and that there can be no moral action in an immoral scenario. And in the modern era, when people are explaining this notion, one of the examples that they tend to use is of the Nazi persecution of Jews. And it reads something like this. Hypothetically, let's say you're living in Germany in 1938, and the Gestapo comes to your door and says, "Hey, do you have any Jews here?" And let's say hypothetically, say also that you do have some Jews that you are hiding in your house. On the one hand, if you say, "Yes, they're right here, come and get them," then you have betrayed these people, you have surrendered them to death, and so forth and so on. If, on the other hand, you say, "Nope, there are no Jews here," then you have lied. And so essentially, when you are placed into these immoral situations, there's no way to get out of it without doing something that is morally objectionable. So these how are these guys going to influence the people around them? Well, in a couple of ways. One, as we've sort of already discussed in our look at the absolute monarchs, with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we are going to have the development of enlightened absolutism. Okay, so very much unlike, say, a Louis XIV who said, "I am the state," or a James I of England who said that the king sort of owes an explanation. No one, the king is the law, all that sort of thing. Some of our later absolute monarchs, like Frederick II of Prussia, Catherine the Great in Russia, to some degree Maria Theresa in Austria, and certainly Joseph II in Austria, are going to sort of change their tack a little bit. So they're still monarchs, they're still ruling relatively absolutely, but they're going to start arguing that the government isn't necessarily just here because God ordained it. The government is here to protect those human liberties that are discussed by people like Locke and Rousseau and Kant and Montesquieu. And if you go back and reread some of those documents that my class took a look at, like, for example, some of the things that Frederick has to say about government, some of the things that Catherine recommended in her plans for that new law code, you see a lot of these kinds of principles. For example, in a lot of these states, we are going to see the abolition of torture, because it is going to be seen as cruel and unusual and not sort of respecting the marvelous felicity of man. You are also going to see an emphasis of rule of law. They're going to say things like, the government must guarantee the people's liberty, and the government must, so we're looking at rule of law, not personality. Unlike, say, a Peter the Great, who could just jail anyone he wanted, execute anyone he wanted, that sort of thing. And there's also going to be a greater emphasis placed on education, right? Developing human beings, preparing them to take advantage of their rights means that they need to be educated, that the individual needs to receive more respect and more attention, rather than just saying, well, you're just a cog in the machine. You need to shut up and sort of play your role. Okay, so even within the absolutist strain, we are beginning to see the impact of this Enlightenment thinking. And remember, Frederick and Catherine, both middle of the 18th century. So by the time Rousseau and Voltaire are writing their works, these ideas are starting to catch on. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the late 18th and early 19th century is going to be a period of profound political change in the Atlantic world, so both in Europe and also in the Americas. Obviously, it's largely going to begin in the North American British colonies, where guys like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine, where we already mentioned him, are going to say things like, Thomas Jefferson says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which you will recall is very, very similar to what Locke has to say about life, liberty, and property. Also, Patrick Henry's speech about give me liberty or give me death, and then in the eventual writing of the American Constitution, the separation of powers, freedom of the press, and the amendments, a Bill of Rights, which is a combination of being modeled off of these Enlightenment philosophes, and then also off of the 1689 Bill of Rights from the Glorious Revolution, the notion of free speech that we see in Voltaire. So the American Revolution very, very heavily influenced, and some would say just straight up plagiarized from many of these European Enlightenment thinkers. That was very much on their minds when they were writing these documents. In France, we are also going to have a revolution in the late 18th century, and the men who are sort of initially at the lead of that revolution are going to write a declaration of the rights of man and the citizen, at which point they will say the aim of all political association, that is all governments, is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. So again, that same idea that there are these natural rights that men have in the state of nature. Same thing in Latin America when we look at the Jamaica letter by Simon Bolivar, a lot of the same types of ideas. Okay, so in some cases, this is going to spur people to make very revolutionary, radical changes. I don't want to go too much farther into sort of the social and cultural impact of the Enlightenment because Ms. Bordelon has already done a very, very solid podcast on that I have previously posted. But I want you to sort of keep this notion of those two sort of twins of modernity, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, that are sort of working together to form this very new worldview, basically, that is going to give us these revolutions, but that is also setting us up for the Industrial Revolution, the enclosure movement, the agricultural revolution in Britain, the development of enlightened absolutism with the enlightened despots. This is a very sharp direction change in many ways that Europe is beginning to take during this period that is going to lead us into a very radically different world from that which has gone before. So keep that in mind, and it was a pleasure chatting with you, and I will be back some other time.